Hello, this is Aware on the Air, a weekly program of discussion and analysis of the news brought to you by the Champaign-Urbana group and the anti-war, anti-racism effort. So our usual anchor is not here, and I will try to hold together tonight's program. Only Karen and myself are here at the moment, but we're expecting some others later. The anti-war, anti-racism effort has been going on since right after 9/11, the anniversary of which is coming up again in a few days. So this is Tuesday, September 8th, I believe, and we'll have a few notes and comments for you about what's going on. The main thing I want to talk about tonight is the report, UN report. I'm sorry, it's not the United Nations. It's another group affiliated about the use of anti-personnel weapons, cluster bombs, and the like. But first, we want to talk a bit about the refugee crisis in Europe and the soul searching that's going on there about who's to be blamed, who's responsible, who should take how many people among these really pathetic refugees that are pouring into Europe from Iraq and Syria and North Africa also, apparently. So who has the obligation to do what for these people? And that's become a very controversial matter. Germany has been showing some leadership here, curiously, in some would say in view of its history, of accepting those people, the foreigners, and France and England are doing something as well, but we're hearing less about the others. The main burden seems to be on Greece and some other Balkan countries at present who can scarcely afford to take in large numbers of aliens. And another ominous development, of course, is that this is feeding the fantasies of the right wing in most of these countries who are anti-immigrant in any case, and it's becoming a real conflict in some countries where you would at least expect it, for example, such as Denmark and Sweden, who are having big reactions to these people, where there's not all that much of ethnic diversity in those countries. And some are saying now that the slogans of diversity and pluralism and all of that are not working, and the European right wing is declaring that this is dead, and we're seeing a lot more reaction by the skinheads and ultra right wingers in Europe, and warning us about the burden that these immigrants will put on the welfare systems in the various states and so on, and how much crime they're committing, and the whole list of objections to these people. So we're hearing some of the same things, of course, in the USA with respect to immigrants from south of the border, and we're being told that they're committing a lot of crimes, murder, rape, the usual list, and we should be reacting to that by building a wall, and it's a pretty ugly picture. So what do you think about the movements of the refugees, Karen? Who has obligation to take them in?
Actually, the greatest responsibility probably lies with us,
Yes,
because we're
yes.
responsible for the bombing and the destruction of Afghanistan and Syria, where I think most of the refugees, I believe, now are fleeing from Syria. But you also have Libya. I mean, we're the number one nation that is responsible. But unfortunately, it's a little harder to get to the U.S. By boat from the shores upon which they've been arriving. So in addition, though, our allies who support our wars of aggression and intervention, such as Germany and France and who else did you mention?
Well,
Belgium?
yeah, all the NATO countries.
Yeah, all the
essentially.
NATO countries definitely do have a responsibility as well. But it must be really irritating to them that, they're our allies. They have supported us in all these wars. They are responsible, but we're the major. We're the major one. So I keep replaying this bully on the playground. When are the bully, when are his friends and supporters going to back off and say, you know what? This isn't worth it. What we're doing is just creating more problems, more horrors in the world, and isolating us, just as eventually some children actually do isolate that bully. One issue related is, yes, and I know in Germany, now I keep thinking initially that what I saw was all of these refugees being turned away. But there were such an outcry on the part of the people and a lot of petitions, then suddenly the governments did come along, like Holland and France and Merkel. So I'm hopeful. I mean, I'm hopeful. I like to think that people power has spoken, at least in Europe. Now in Germany, I saw on RT yesterday that Pegida, that's the extreme right-wing organization that is very anti-immigrant, they were out in full force opposing the influx of refugees. But at the same time, you had a much larger crowd of people who were there welcoming them. So there is something uplifting about this when you see that the people, most of the people throughout, were actually going against their governments who were halting refugees from entering. The people are opening up and saying, no, we will provide you, we will take care of you. Now, there is another perspective on this that I just saw this morning. Someone saying that this is now being used to foment more war, meaning that some people will see this as an excuse to go in and totally destroy Syria. I already thought we had, but to really bring about regime change, to go in full force with our bombers now. So, because I can't imagine anyone thinking that that's the way to solve the problem. The way to solve the problem is to stop the bombing, to stop the destruction. Most of these people don't want to leave their homes, but they've had no other option. We've known about the refugees in the Asian area, the Rohingyas who are fleeing northeastern, just North Burma. And eventually, after many drowned, many were taken in by slave traders, but turned away by Southeast Asian nations after there was enough publicity and enough of an outcry about it. Then some of those governments, Malaysia, Thailand, and one other, did agree to start taking in some of those refugees. So people powered and publicity, most of which we get only on the internet or RT or some of the democracy now, but we're not getting it on the corporate news media whatsoever.
Well, most of the discussions seems to be devoted to who do we blame, and to me that's always been futile and a waste of time to devote yourself entirely to the question of who do we blame, who's the bad person here, the evil force behind all of this. And at some stage, of course, it becomes important to identify some of the people involved. But I just usually conclude that the blame game is a big waste of time. And what we need is more analysis of the fundamental social forces that are at work in these situations and figure out how to cool them off and take away their motivation for fighting and violent conflict.
Well, when you say the blame game, I understand certainly on an individual basis, blaming this person or that person. I mean, that is very much back to elementary school again, you know, ridiculous, and serves no purpose to shame an individual. But I think if there's to be any form of justice in this world, then there's no justice unless there is an apology and trial, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure that playing the blame game is me saying, well, the U.S. is most responsible, but to ignore that, I think, is an injustice.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I wasn't suggesting it should be completely ignored, but it seems to me that is what you talk about in the last analysis and not in the first. So.
Well, if you're saying there are some people, maybe I'm hearing you wrong, but there are some people who I've noted who only just want to blame the U.S. and they don't want to even think about taking in the refugees.
Right.
I'm saying that the first thing to do is to take in the refugees on a humanitarian basis. That's the first thing you do is you act, you try to take care of them, but then you want to prevent more refugees from being forced into this situation.
Right.
And that's where we have to stop the bombing and stop the killing, I think.
So I haven't heard about whether Russia or Ukraine are taking any of these people. Israel is not taking any officially, although apparently there is a non-governmental group that is trying to send them some supplies and make life easier for them. But officially the Israeli government says no way. So do you know about any other countries?
No, I don't. Not offhand, I don't.
Yeah.
Again, it's where they land, you know, I think they land in Italy, they land in, because they're coming by boat, they land in Greece, and then they move on up. And I know that last week we were talking, the goal was to reach Hungary, and then they would be free to enter into.
Well, for a time they weren't. That was one of the big problems that got Hungary a very bad press. They were holding those people there in the train station in Budapest, and there were no trains for them. And finally, I think Hungary relented, and there was a lot of bad-mouthing of the prime minister there. But yeah, it's a terrible situation.
It is
everywhere. And but again, I will just inject my own view that to spend a lot of time on who do we blame personally for this is a big waste of time. But anyway, after you've satisfied yourself about who is to be blamed for this, what follows? What happens? And do we punish them somehow, or I mean, what good does that do? And how does that deal with this situation? Can we have some more productive thinking about this? And usually not.
Well, I think there are plans afoot now to send in ground troops, the U.S. ground troops. Now, whether there will be our soldiers or whether they'll be mercenaries, to send them into Syria. And I think I mentioned that last week I had seen that, but I'm seeing more and more of it. And I can see them using the refugee crisis as an excuse.
Yeah.
And I think there is something to the fact that there is some mention of the fact that, well, it's these countries and they're infighting and internal wars and, you know, Sunnis and shit. And it's like, but the reality is it's the exterior, it's the outside, it's the intervention from the West that is causing the situation. So, you know, when we talk about playing the blame game, at the same time, we have to recognize the geopolitical situation as it is, and if we're going to stop more refugees. Actually, I don't think we're ever going to stop more refugees. Maybe a month ago now, I did read the latest Pentagon report. I didn't read the whole thing, I just read certain passages. But I also read from Michael Hudson's commentary on it. Was it Michael Hudson or Michael Whitney? Now I'm not sure. I think it was Michael Whitney. And bottom line, what the Pentagon is asking for is simply more war. Yeah. More war, more war. There's more planning for more war. Well, the more war we have, the more refugees we're going to have fleeing because these nations have already been so destroyed. I also want to mention that, you know, I pointed out that Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. I'm going to read a passage which may not appear to be related, but it is. Here's a brief that she says is that climate change isn't an issue to add to the list of things to worry about, such as, or next to health care and taxes. She said it's a civilizational wake-up call, a powerful message spoken in the language of fires, floods, droughts, and extinctions, telling us that we need an entirely new economic model and a new way of sharing this planet, telling us that we need to evolve, and we have to move very, very quickly. Yeah. Now, she has also talked about transmigrations, and that's what fires and flood and drought and starvation. And in some of these cases, even some of these refugees are coming from areas, and I'm not sure now whether it was Yemen, Syria, where it actually originated with the fact that they were starving because of the drought. And so, and it's due to global warming. Yeah. So, and then you add to that the bombing. It's going to continue, and it's going to get much, much worse. Yeah. So unless we look at the actual cause and do something to prevent the cause, it's just going to continue.
Yeah. Well, how much space or time does she devote to identifying the guilty party, which is what a lot of people seem to be satisfied with doing?
That's ridiculous. I mean, she talks about the developed nations, okay? Yeah. The developed nations, and we have to take leadership. We know that probably China is creating more pollution because they're the center of manufacturing, but they also get a lot of it from the Gobi Desert. So a lot of it has to do with location. But, you know, they are, I know for a fact, they are doing something about it. They are really moving as far as solar power. They are doing something about wind power. As we aren't doing anything. In fact, they've now taken the lead in production on solar and wind power. Plus, you have to take into mind that we have been doing this much, much longer.
Yes.
And they only started it, in the 70s, I think. Right. It was, with manufacturing. Yeah. So, you know, for us, the leaders, to get out there and just point the blame, and that's where I see playing the blame game as being ridiculous, where they just point at China, blame China for everything, is ridiculous. We have to take the first step. We have to initiate it and try to take a lead. I mean, other nations, it's mostly the indigenous peoples throughout the world who have been trying to do something, and it's really unfair. They're doing it because they are really suffering the consequences.
Yeah. Well, I'm suspicious of the notion of leadership and who's going to be the leader. Leading up to the first election of Barack Obama, he had a piece published in Foreign Affairs in which he talked about restoring American leadership and used the term leader or leadership some 20-some times by my account. And what is the agenda hidden in the use of the term leadership? And we're going to be the leader. Yeah, and will we be displaced as the global leader? And so on.
Well, that's the rhetoric. I have to mention something that I saw in Democracy Now! This morning, and it makes me laugh. It's the only thing that makes me laugh. Donald Trump. He was being interviewed. This may not appear to be related, but it is in my case. He was being interviewed. I've forgotten where, some hotel, I think, in New York or something, maybe elsewhere. I wasn't paying that much attention because I don't pay attention to Trump, but it was pointed out by Alan Nair afterwards, the journalist, that Trump evidently to prove that, yeah, you know, he supports Social Security, he supports, he's opposed to TPP, you know, some of these good things, but only for white people, you know, okay? He blames foreigners, he blames the immigrants for everything. But that's essentially Trump. So when he's there, he finds himself some foreigners, dignitaries who happen to be Asian, to trot them out, to introduce them, to show that, you know, he's really, you know, he's not a racist. He's not.
Oh, right.
Just. Well, of course, the people that he trotted out, and Alan Nair knows very well, because Alan Nair has spent decades covering Indonesia. And it turns out that the person he brought out was the Speaker of the House, who's a right-hand man of General Prabowo and Subianto, former President Subianto. I mean, they're responsible for the deaths of, it's in the millions, okay, of Indonesia. So it's, of course, Trump doesn't know this. He just thinks, oh, look, here's some visiting dignitaries of Asian descent, and, you know, I can show what a good guy I am, you know. So that made me laugh. Not much on the news these days makes me laugh.
Right. Well, yeah, there's this old phenomenon, really, of showing that you're not racist by hiring a token black person or something and putting her typically at the front desk. And
Right.
And you can tell
It's usually a
everyone.
her.
Yeah, yeah. See, we're not racist.
Right.
So it goes. But yeah.
Actually, I did want to mention Guatemala while I'm at it. And you say, well, I'm at it because Alan Nairn has spent a good deal of time covering Guatemala. And last week, there was a lot of euphoria because the Guatemalan people, primarily indigenous people, who've suffered so much, and it goes back to 1954 with our intervention into Guatemala, but they actually were able to have the president, is it Molina,
Yeah.
step down, resign, on charges of corruption. And then he was jailed. Now, the charges to get him out of power and to get him jailed are corruption. But they really, the goal is to go after him for crimes against humanity, of which he is guilty of. So this was really positive. But then this morning, Alan was talking about how they're going ahead with the election. And what's wrong with that? They were scheduled to have elections. They should not be going ahead with it now. And the problem is they're being forced to choose now between two evils. And even the lesser of two evils, he discusses it. It's this woman, Torres. There is almost no doubt that either one who is elected is not going to proceed with incarcerating or suing or, you know, President Molina, because, you know, they're all connected one way or another. So that was very demoralizing to hear that, and it brought me then to the idea that elections in Thailand, you know, they did up a new constitution, the military junta, but now when it came up for a vote, they voted against it. Very junta that actually created it. Now, it's because within that constitution, with a lot of things there that we don't want to hear about, they were supposed to call for new elections in 2017. And some are saying, well, they don't want to have elections in 2017. This is very much an Asian stalling tactic. I've worked with it. I know how that works. They'll just put it off and have to redo the Constitution, which means who knows when they'll have elections. So elections are a good thing sometimes, but they're not a good thing sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what you're referring to. We had Obama with his rhetoric talking about leadership, and he was our peace candidate, and now we're at war and droning seven nations as opposed to how many under Bush?
More ominous developments in Syria in particular. Russia apparently has been sending some military supplies to the Assad regime there. And they're saying, look, this is routine. It's what we've been doing all along. Why should you object to it now? But the USA has been doing, apparently, is leaning on some other countries, such as Greece and Romania, I think it is, to deny overflight to Russian airplanes who are sending the supplies to Syria, to the Assad regime in Syria. And Russia does have a major interest there. They have a naval base at the eastern end of the Mediterranean on the Syrian coast.
One?
Well, the only one big one as far as I know.
Just one, though. I'm compared to the number of naval
right.
bases the U.S. has around the world.
Yeah. So I'm starting to read some people saying that we can't deal with the Syrian war without involving Russia to some extent, and yet we have this enormous momentum of trying to blame Russia and Vladimir Putin in particular for everything.
Everything.
And he's become the all-around villain, the supreme demon now in the American media, and he's doing what he thinks is the right thing to do, dealing with an ally, and we'll have to cope with that somehow, rather than just continuing to denounce Vladimir Putin and blame him for everything. But the question then is, will Greece and these other countries, the immediate question, allow Russian military planes to fly over their countries? And if the USA can get them to deny that to the Russians, then that will only increase, it will escalate the tension,
right,
which is already high enough. And we seem to be building toward more and more war in that area, in Syria and in Ukraine. As I've mentioned here several times before, the paradox there in Ukraine is that the Kiev government has spent a lot of time and money apparently on cultivating nationalism among the young people and the schools and so on. And now when they're trying to pass some measure that will end the war and the fighting and killing by saying we'll give some degree of independence to the two easternmost provinces in Ukraine, so that they will no longer be completely under the control of Kiev. Now they can't do it because the nationalists that they've cultivated are marching in the streets and rioting and killing people because they don't want the legislature there to change the law or the Constitution apparently enough to allow those two easternmost provinces to become in some degree independent if they will promise to be neutral as between Russia apparently and NATO. But and Russia, of course, objects strongly, as it always has, to having NATO members right on its doorstep there across the boundary line from Russia. They've always said that they will never permit that, but we seem to be incapable of taking them seriously on that point, and they're not apparently ever going to compromise on that. And in view of the history of invasions from the West in Russia, I can understand their point of view to some extent, their historical and cultural claims, and why it is that Russia is not allowed to have defensible borders, because we always hear this from the Israelis, that we must have defensible borders, but Russia can't be allowed to have them. It's curious, the different ways in which this is handled and rationalized and justified and so on.
Well, I think what's really sad too is that Russia may be providing Syria, the Assad regime, with military supplies, but they're also providing humanitarian aid, food, medical aid, and that's being blockaded as we will. I mean, that's a very serious situation. And as far as this, Russia supplying military weapons, well, hello, who's the biggest supplier of military weapons to Israel, to all of these other nations that, that are working on our behalf sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to raise the question of banned weapons being used in the Middle East and elsewhere. There's a report by the Cluster Munition Coalition. An annual report said that cluster bombs have been documented in armed conflicts in Libya, Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. The use of these weapons was criticized by all 117 countries that have joined the treaty, which took effect 5 years ago. Their use was also criticized by a number of others that have not yet joined the treaty, excuse me, but appear to have abided by its provisions. The new use of cluster munitions, they say, by a handful of armed forces outside the ban has been met with swift and strong condemnation, showing the stigma against their use is growing stronger, said the director of the Arms Division of Human Rights Watch and the editor of the annual report. The treaty prohibits all use of cluster munitions and sets deadlines for the destruction of stockpiles and the clearance of areas contaminated by unexploded cluster bomblets, which can be deadly if disturbed. The treaty also provides for assistance to victims of cluster bombs. The United States, which is among the countries that have not signed the treaty, still produces and exports cluster munitions. In a telephone interview, Mrs. Wareham said although the United States had sharply reduced its supply of cluster munitions, at least 3 different types of American-made cluster munitions had been used by Saudi-led forces this year in the Yemen conflict.
And who sells weapons to Saudi?
Yeah, right.
The U.S.
They were all made in the USA,
Right.
but the USA is saying we're innocent because we didn't use them directly ourselves. We just sold them to these other people.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, we don't use that excuse when it comes to drugs. I mean,
Yeah, right. So she goes on to say the United States reserves the right to use, transfer, and stockpile the munitions, unfortunately, so we cannot say that they abide by its provisions. While American officials have expressed concern about the use of cluster munitions in the conflicts in Syria, Ukraine, and Sudan, they've been more ambiguous about their use in Yemen by our allies, of course, the Saudis. Asked at a daily press briefing on August 20 about the American position, the State Department spokesman John Kirby said he was aware of reports that the Saudis have used cluster munitions and that the United States had discussed these reports with the Saudis, but he did not confirm or deny that American-supplied cluster weapons had been used. Well, it goes on then to describe the use of cluster weapons by government forces and Russian-backed insurgents in eastern Ukraine. They used cluster rockets on each other in attacks that began last year, but the use of these weapons appeared to stop in February after a ceasefire was declared. The report said that Saudi Arabia and possibly other members of a Saudi-led coalition that has been bombing Yemen's Houthi rebels since March have used American-made cluster munitions in that conflict. So this is a very interesting discussion about who is using these anti-personnel weapons, which are banned in many cases because they're so indiscriminate, and they are used mainly to kill and maim a lot of people who are not combatants. So the use of these things was noted by Israel, for example, in the 51-day war last summer. There's a history of them using white phosphorus, which is a really vicious weapon. But there's a loophole in what's called international law on this weapon. White phosphorus is the best available means of illumination for nighttime use on battlefields and so on, in addition to being a really vicious, flesh-eating fire when it's dropped on personnel. So what international law apparently says is it's okay if it's not being used against personnel explicitly, but if it's just used for flares and battlefield illumination, then that's okay. So the discussion of this becomes very legalistic at some point. The Israelis saying, well, we didn't use it, and then later saying, well, actually we did, but it was used only for flares, battlefield illumination, and not because of some anti-personnel purpose and so on. So it's a very tangled discussion. The USA has never joined, for example, the International Treaty on Landmines. We're apparently not planting anymore these days and are making attempts to clear them in various places, but they are still apparently theoretically acceptable for use by the USA. Syria's government, this report said, has been dropping cluster bombs since mid-2012 and later began launching rockets with cluster warheads. The report also said that Islamic State militants in Syria used cluster rockets in the second half of 2014. So for the most part, these weapons, when they are used, are coming from the USA indirectly. And it's a very disgusting situation. So what do you think a cluster weapon is, Karen?
I don't know that much about cluster weapons. But it sounds pretty awful. But excuse me. But I know that we don't sign the treaties, and then we tell ourselves that, well, we can just do whatever we want to do, and that's what we do. Even when we do sign the treaties, we ignore them. Let me just make one little plug here for a film I just watched. We heard so much about American Sniper. Okay, it was a big film, made all the theaters, took it forever to get to Redbox. It was very popular. It was up for an Academy Award. But it's a propaganda film. I mean, there's no question, war propaganda film. Then I saw last week a movie called Good Kill, starring Ethan Hawke and others. It's about the drone war. And it's very thought-provoking, and it gives you a glimpse of what it's like for a pilot who's actually shooting off the drones and killing people, what this person is seeing, what they're going through, who's ordering it. So to me, this was a very powerful, worthwhile movie to see. And it's funny because I found it on Redbox and I had never heard of it before. So I don't know if it ever made it to the big theaters. I have no idea. Another film I then watched here recently was The Water Diviner. That's a film starring and directed by, I think produced by Russell Crowe. Now it deals with World War I, and a lot of it takes place it's an Australian film, either it takes place in Australia or it takes place in Turkey. So of course I like seeing anything that takes place in Turkey. It's very much an anti-war film, a message film. I mean, and I thought an excellent film. But again, I'd never heard of it till I found it at Redbox. So
what was the title of the previous one you mentioned?
The first one is Good Kill.
Good Kill.
Because that's what they say. That's what the pilot, the drone operator says when it's been a success.
Oh, it's kind of an
They say
aesthetic comment.
Good Kill. Good Kill.
Yeah.
Right. And now I want to recommend a book that I just bought, have not yet read, but briefed through it. I'm always looking for structure and how to and how things work. And we always talk about the corporate-owned media and the corporate-owned government that we have and the lobbyists who buy our Congress members and how they work for the corporations. But I kept thinking to myself, how does that actually work? How do the corporations manage to get their needs met? You know, it's not like we've got the CEOs of Lockheed Martin necessarily sitting down with the president in his office or with a congressman, or does it? And that's why I bought this book, and I recommend it. It's by Lawrence Shoup. It's called Wall Street's Think Tank. It's out in hardback. I couldn't even get it in paperback. And you'll have to Google, because I don't know if Amazon has it or not. I had to go right to the source to purchase it. It was recommended by someone here on the show or on RT, I'm not sure. But what it actually talks about is the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the most influential foreign policy think tank in the United States. And just briefing it, you see how really complex it all is. You have the think tanks, you have the members of these think tanks that regulate not just Wall Street, but all foreign policy and their positions in our government. I mean, Kissinger, Brzezinski, Geithner, I mean, you name them, they're probably a member of the CFR. And it explains a lot. And as I said, it's not easy, but it offers you sort of a roadmap or a structure to how our government actually works and why neoliberalism being introduced in the 70s by CFR, and why there's so much complexity out there, and why if we don't do something. And as you say, I mean, whether you elect a Republican or a Democrat today, you're just getting the lesser of evils, it seems.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's an enormous institutional momentum in the State Department and the Pentagon and so on. And the substitution of one person for another typically has very little effect on,
Almost no effect,
on any
yeah.
of this.
Yeah.
And the question then becomes, how do we turn around these entire institutions? And that's
Yeah.
a very difficult question to answer. It typically happens only as a result of revolution, barricades and bonfires in the streets, so on, as happened
In the past, yeah.
in Ukraine and a few other places, or war, or some major catastrophe. And would anything short of an invasion from outer space do it to us in the foreseeable future? Well, I'm not at all sure.
Well, with global warming, I mean,
Yeah, well, that may have.
will that have an effect? I don't
yeah,
know. I don't know.
Effects on the same scale, but
Yeah.
We'll see. So back to what is a cluster munition, an anti-personnel weapon, and so on.
Well, is it similar to a mine? Does it have the same effect as a mine?
Well, yeah. What happens with landmines is that thousands of them are planted. For example, in the no man's land between North and South Korea, there are mines there that have been maiming people. Typically, they just blow off one leg or something. But there's been some conflict between North and South.
I think that was just last
over that.
week.
Yeah,
Yeah, we talked about that.
So that seems to be a very strange on and again, off again relationship between North and South Korea. The news this morning is that they've agreed on a scheme for a visitation of South Korean people to the North to unite with family members that they haven't seen for years, and so on. And this keeps happening again and again.
Well,
And
if we just stay out, I mean, last week immediately after that mine, I think they killed, what, 2 people, 2 South Koreans were killed by the mine, and it was a North Korean mine. I may not have the numbers right. And the headlines on CNN was that the Pentagon was preparing to assist our allies in South Korea. And I'm like, oh my God. Well, then suddenly that went quiet and dead because the South Koreans and the North Koreans, they came to an agreement, and there was, you know, it was a regret. There was not an apology. Regret means you're not taking responsibility, but they seemed to solve the problem. And as I keep pointing out, Asians are very capable of solving problems themselves if we just leave them alone and stop intervening. And I don't have the I don't have the expertise on the Maghreb or on the Middle East, but I rather suspect they probably do just as well if foreigners would just back out and mind their own business. I don't know. I can't say, but.
The definition of a cluster bomb is typically one that has only 10 to 20% of its weight by high explosives, and the rest of it consists of shrapnel or little bomblets or so on that are supposed to rain down over a wide area and kill all of the personnel, shall we say, that are within its explosive radius.
Well, Ron, one of the things that I liked about this film, Good Kill, I mean, it's very moving, is that when you're in there with the pilot or the operator of the drone, you see that the drone, there's no way it's going to target just one person because it takes in it takes in such a large space. Anybody within that space or anybody who begins to walk into that space is going to be killed. So is a cluster bomb the same thing, meaning that it's not going to just get one person, it's going to get many people within that vicinity?
Yeah, the American version is sometimes called a daisy cutter, which is a bomb that explodes a short distance in the air and spreads out bomblets and shrapnel over a wide area and killing everyone.
And then we call we call it all collateral damage because civilians, women, children are being killed. Oh well, that's just collateral damage.
Yeah. So I'm not sure these are a different category from what the United States used in Vietnam, napalm, which was spreading this flaming jellied gasoline over large areas and, of course, killing everyone in that area indiscriminately. And Agent Orange, which was used as a defoliant in Vietnam, killing anyone in the area apparently, or leaving enough traces of chemicals to cause birth defects for generations afterwards.
In fact, when I was on the border of Thailand and Cambodia, Rania Pratet, in 1979, that was when the Vietnamese had just intervened into Cambodia, there was talk from other people working up there on the border, NGOs, etc., that they came away extremely dizzy and feeling strange, and there was talk that it had something to do with Agent Orange. Well, I went up there because I didn't even know whether Agent Orange had been used in that vicinity, but I have to admit, I came back and I was like really dizzy and spacey. So what we think, though, is that it was just remnants, probably from what had been dumped down by the U.S. in Vietnam, and on those borders of Cambodia, which where our incursion into Cambodia originally was that, well, the Vietnamese are hiding in there. That killed so many Cambodians. But there's residue. I mean, we know now that, okay, there was nuclear material buried in somewhere around, St. Louis, Missouri, and they have a high cancer rate as a result. And that goes back to 1945? So, you know, residue of these chemicals.
I understand that Vietnamese farmers are still being injured today, maimed by these bombs.
Oh, and the Plain of Jars area of Laos where we drop, oh, it's terrible. It's really terrible, yeah.
This defines a daisy cutter bomb as a very large conventional bomb delivered by aircraft and designed to explode a short distance above the ground with the blast damage concentrated at ground level and a radius extending for hundreds of feet. The biggest one, apparently ever, was an American bomb called Big Blue, used in Afghanistan. A reliable and deadly 15,000-pound fragmentation bomb that explodes just above the ground with a large radius. It is the largest conventional bomb in existence, called BLU-82, called Big Blue. So that's weapons used by the USA in some cases, and no one else, as far as I know. Of course, there's your usual complaint about indignation against helicopter gunships when they're used by people that we don't like. But of course, when they're used by our allies, nothing is said. And of course, the indignation about beheadings when carried out by ISIS, Islamic State. They're horrible, sure, monsters they really are. But actually, beheadings are an everyday occurrence in Saudi Arabia,
Right.
Occurring at approximately the rate of one a day. And again, nothing is said. So, CIA drones have targeted Islamic State leaders in Syria, and indeed, there are reports now that Pakistan has started using drones against people. The Taliban, apparently, that have come over into Pakistan, or maybe they're still just in Afghanistan. So drones are becoming more and more popular. We're hearing more and more countries using them. And I suspect it's only a matter of time before some drone hits the Pentagon or the White House or whatever. These technological developments cannot be kept secret forever. There was a big fallacy about this at the time, the early 50s, the time of the atomic bomb, that there was all this concern about some spies were going to take the secret of the atomic bomb to Soviet Russia. And it was pointed out quite rightly by a number of people that it can be secret only for so long. Any scientific or technological development will eventually be copied or found out by them too. And whether these spies taking the secret to them that they wouldn't otherwise be able to find out is a complete fallacy. But anyway.
Well, one of the points you made about people seeing on TV, we saw the burning alive of a Jordanian soldier by ISIS, and it was horrible. Now multiply that by the hundreds, the thousands. That's what we're doing with our drones, with the bombings, with the cluster bombs.
Yeah. This says the clandestine program, that is the U.S. Special Forces drones that are being used to target and kill Islamic State leaders in Syria, is separate from America's wider military operations against Islamic State fighters. This is reported by the Washington Post, citing unnamed U.S. officials. Among those killed was Jinnah Hussain, a British hacker who was recruiting for lone wolf attacks in the West. The drone program has resulted in only a handful of strikes, this says, which are being carried out by the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. The CIA's main role in the operation is identifying and locating senior Islamic State leaders. The official said the program was focusing on high-value targets. A decision to use the CIA's Counterterrorism Center and JSOC in the operation reflects rising anxiety about the spread of Islamic State. And at that level, the CIA, JSOC, and American counterterrorism operations and elite military forces all come together in the same thing. So we have only 5 minutes left, but is there anything else that needs to be said today?
Well, only
Karen?
that we should mention Yemen. Half the population, I mentioned it last week, I don't think it's changed, half the population is starving to death, and it's a result of our war. We are supporting Saudi Arabia, who's committing the crimes against, we support them. And people have to understand what it means by support. It means with weapons, military weapons, and encouragement.
Reuters, August 31st. 2 U.S. F-22 fighter jets arrived in Poland as part of a European training mission. 2 advanced U.S. F-22 fighter jets arrived in Poland on Monday for a one-day working visit, the Polish Army said, as part of Washington's efforts to reassure allies made uneasy by Russians' actions in Ukraine. How many of them are being made uneasy by Americans' actions?
Right.
There are
Exactly.
not mentioned.
Well, when you talk about NATO on the border of Russia, I mean, compare it to how we would feel if Russia had their weapons on the border of Canada or Mexico. You know, it just.
Yeah. So, final note. Thousands of Palestinian structures are under Israeli demolition orders. Agence France-Presse. Some 13,000 Palestinian structures in the West Bank are currently under Israeli demolition orders, leaving residents and homes in a state of chronic uncertainty and threat, the UN said Monday. More than 11,000 Israeli demolition orders relating to the estimated 13,000 Palestinian structures are currently awaiting implementation in a new swath of occupied West Bank, said the report titled Under Threat. The Area C, as this is called, is the administrative region created under the Oslo Accords of 1995. Between 1988 and 2014, Israel issued more than 14,000 demolition orders against Palestinian-owned structures, of which upwards of 11,000 are currently outstanding, it said. The UN figures show that Israel's destruction of 63 houses and other structures in a single week in August left 132 Palestinians homeless. And then, of course, we wonder why they are trying to fight back and invited to become very indignant about their attacks on the Israeli occupiers and so on. So look for us Saturday morning, September 12th at the Farmers Market, downtown Urbana. We'll be there to talk with you, try to answer your questions, and we'll have some paraphernalia there that may interest you, calendars and bumper stickers and buttons and all that sort of thing.
Some books.
Some
books.
So books, yes. And that's about all for this week. Tune in again next week when we'll have further discussion and debate about threats to world peace and the rise of racism in a number of places around the globe. So this is Ron Szoke for Karen Aram and other members and friends of AWARE, signing off for this week. And thank you and good night.